I used to think the most dangerous predators in America's forests walked on four legs, until I discovered what the government has been hiding in the shadows for decades. My name is Dr. Elena Vasquez, and for 12 years, I worked as a senior researcher for the Department of Interior's Wildlife Preservation Division. What I'm about to tell you will change how you view every national park, every hiking trail, every camping trip you've ever taken. 3 months ago, I was approached by a shadow department within our government, one that doesn't officially exist. They needed someone with my expertise in interdimensional physics and wildlife biology for what they called Project Threshold. I thought I was being recruited to study unusual animal behavior. I was wrong. So very, very wrong. Welcome back to the Obscura Law Vault, where we uncover the truths they never wanted you to know. I'm your host, and today's investigation will take us deep into the Pacific Northwest, where something ancient and hungry has been feeding, and our government has been helping it. The video you're about to experience is "The Government Knows What Lives in America's Forests, and It Shouldn't Exist." Chapter 1. The Recruitment. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning in March. I was reviewing migration patterns for the elk population in Olympic National Forest when my secretary buzzed in. "Dr. Chen, there's a Colonel Morrison here to see you. He says it's classified." I'd never heard that name before, but when a military officer shows up at your government office unannounced, you listen. Colonel Morrison was a tall, gaunt man with eyes that seemed to have seen too much. He carried himself with the rigid posture of someone who'd spent years making decisions other people couldn't live with. "Dr. Vasquez," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Your work on quantum biological interfaces caught our attention. Specifically, your theoretical papers on dimensional membrane permeability in living organisms." I felt my stomach drop. Those papers weren't supposed to be accessible to anyone outside my research circle. They were theoretical work, impossible theories about creatures that could exist between dimensions, feeding off the energy differential between realities. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, Colonel." He slid a manila folder across my desk. Inside were photocopies of research I'd never published, calculations I'd worked on in private, late-night theories I'd explored when the bourbon made impossible ideas seem plausible. "We need someone with your expertise, Dr. Vasquez, someone who understands that the natural world operates on laws we're only beginning to comprehend." The photographs in that folder changed everything. Blurry images taken with infrared cameras showed shapes moving through dense forest canopy, shapes that didn't conform to any known animal anatomy. Long, segmented limbs that seemed to phase in and out of visibility. Eyes that reflected light from angles that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. "What am I looking at?" I whispered. "Something that's been living in our forests for longer than humans have walked this continent. Something that's been contained, studied, and fed by a very small group of people who understand that some secrets are too dangerous for the public." Morrison leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Project Threshold has been operational for 47 years, Dr. Vasquez. We've learned to coexist with these entities, even learned to benefit from them. But recently, something's changed. They're becoming more active, more aggressive. The barriers between their reality and ours are weakening." "What kind of barriers?" "The kind that keep predators from hunting in dimensions they were never meant to access." I should have walked away, should have reported Morrison to my supervisors, should have demanded answers about how classified research had been accessed. Instead, I found myself asking the question that doomed me. "What exactly do you need me to do?" Morrison smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Only the grim satisfaction of someone who'd successfully recruited another soul into damnation. Pack for 2 weeks in the Pacific Northwest, Dr. Vasquez, and bring your most open mind. You're going to need it. Chapter 2. Olympic Shadows. The drive to the Olympic Peninsula took place during one of the worst storms I'd ever experienced. Morrison drove while I studied the briefing materials he'd provided, documents that read like science fiction horror novels, if science fiction novels were written by government bureaucrats with security clearances. The entities, designated as Class 7 interdimensional biologics, had first been documented in 1976 by a Forest Service team investigating unusual wildlife disappearances. What they found defied every law of physics and biology known to science. The initial contact event resulted in the loss of 3 researchers, Morrison explained, as we wound through increasingly dense forest roads. The survivors described creatures that seemed to exist partially in our reality and partially elsewhere. They could phase through solid matter, manipulate local gravitational fields, and worst of all, they could perfectly mimic any living thing they'd consumed. The research facility was hidden deep within Olympic National Forest, accessible only through a series of unmarked logging roads that didn't appear on any public maps. From the outside, it looked like a standard Forest Service station, a few buildings, some equipment storage, radio towers, but beneath the innocent facade lay something that would have made the most creative horror writer weep with envy. The elevator descended for what felt like several minutes, taking us far beneath the forest floor. When the doors opened, I stepped into a world that challenged everything I thought I knew about government operations. The underground complex stretched in multiple directions, with corridors disappearing into darkness, beyond the reach of the fluorescent lighting. The walls were lined with monitors displaying data I couldn't immediately interpret. Wave patterns, dimensional readings, biological signatures that fluctuated in ways that made my eyes water to follow. "Welcome to Station Threshold," Morrison said. "Population, 27 humans, and somewhere between 5 and 12 entities that exist across multiple dimensional planes simultaneously." Dr. Benjamin Cross, the facility's chief researcher, met us at the main laboratory. He was a man who looked like he hadn't slept properly in years, with the kind of exhaustion that goes deeper than physical fatigue. His handshake was firm, but his fingers trembled slightly. "Dr. Vasquez, I've read your work. Brilliant theoretical framework for understanding dimensional membrane dynamics. I hope you're prepared to see those theories put into practice." The main laboratory was a cathedral of scientific instruments I couldn't begin to identify. Massive displays showed real-time feeds from hundreds of cameras positioned throughout the Olympic Peninsula. But it wasn't the technology that caught my attention. It was the feeding chamber. Through a reinforced observation window, I could see into a space that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The walls appeared to curve and fold back on themselves, creating impossible geometries that hurt to look at directly. And moving through that space were shapes that my brain couldn't properly process. "Jesus Christ," I whispered. "God has nothing to do with this place," Cross replied. "These entities exist in a state of constant dimensional flux. They feed on the boundary energy between realities, but they've developed a taste for something more substantial." One of the shapes moved closer to the observation window, and for a moment I caught a glimpse of something that will haunt my dreams forever. It looked like a deer, a perfect replica of a Pacific Northwest white-tailed deer. But as it moved, parts of its body would phase in and out of visibility, revealing glimpses of something underneath that wasn't remotely mammalian. The thing that looked like a deer turned its head toward our observation window, and I saw its eyes. They were compound eyes, like an insect's, but each facet reflected a different reality. In some, I saw the forest as it existed now. In others, I saw the same forest centuries ago, or centuries in the future, or versions where humans had never existed at all. But in one facet, I saw myself, not as I was in that moment, but as I would be in 3 days, screaming in terror as something with too many teeth prepared to wear my face. "Dr. Vasquez?" Cross's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right?" I realized I was hyperventilating. "What the hell are those things?" "Predators," Morrison answered. "Predators from a reality where the food chain operates on principles we're still trying to understand." Chapter 3. The Feeding Protocol. My first week at Station Threshold was spent learning the facility's daily routines, and every routine revolved around one terrifying reality: feeding time. At exactly 6 a.m., 2 p.m. and 10 p.m., the facility would go into what Cross called Protocol 7. All non-essential personnel would retreat to designated safe areas while a small team prepared the daily offerings for our interdimensional guests. The entities require approximately 2,000 calories of living biomass per feeding cycle, Cross explained as we walked toward the preparation chamber. But it's not the calories they're after. It's the dimensional energy that living things carry between realities. The feeding preparation area was a nightmare made real. Dozens of cages lined the walls, containing everything from rabbits and deer to larger predators like mountain lions and bears. But these weren't ordinary animals. Each one had been fitted with some kind of collar that emitted a low pulsing frequency. "Dimensional anchors," Cross explained when he saw me staring. Without them, the entities would drain the animal's life force from across multiple realities simultaneously. The death would be unpleasant to witness. Dr. Lisa Hartwell, the facility's xenobiologist, was overseeing the preparation of the day's offering. She was a small woman with prematurely grey hair and hands that shook constantly from what I later learned was chronic exposure to dimensional radiation. "Today's menu is 3 white-tailed deer, 2 rabbits, and 1 black bear," she announced to the team. The bear is a juvenile, approximately 180 pounds. Remember, the larger specimens require secondary containment protocols during the transfer. I watched in fascinated horror as the feeding team loaded the animals onto specialized gurneys, equipped with restraint systems that looked more like medieval torture devices than scientific equipment. The animals weren't sedated. Cross had explained that unconscious animals didn't provide the dimensional energy signature the entities required. "Dr. Vasquez," Hartwell called out, "would you like to observe the feeding process from the primary observation deck?" The primary observation deck overlooked the main containment chamber, a space that existed in what Cross called controlled dimensional flux. Through the reinforced viewing windows, I could see the feeding chamber's impossible geometry: walls that curved back on themselves, ceiling that seemed to exist at multiple heights simultaneously, floor that rippled like water but supported solid weight. "Initiating dimensional barrier reduction," announced a technician over the intercom. "All personnel maintain safe distance from viewing portals." The air in the chamber began to shimmer, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. And then they came. The entities emerged from spaces between spaces, sliding into our reality like oil seeping through cracks in reality's foundation. At first, they appeared as vague shadows, dark shapes that didn't quite have fixed forms. But as they fully materialized, my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. They were beautiful and terrible simultaneously. Their bodies seemed to be constructed from living geometry, curves and angles that folded through dimensions my eyes couldn't properly track. They moved with fluid grace, like dancers performing to music only they could hear. "How many are there?" I whispered. "We've identified at least 7 distinct entities," Cross replied, "but their dimensional nature makes accurate counting challenging. They exist as individuals and as collective consciousness simultaneously. The first deer was released into the chamber through an automated system that kept human personnel safely removed from the feeding area. The animal bounded into the space, immediately sensing the wrongness of its environment. What happened next will forever be burned into my memory. The nearest entity approached the deer, and as it drew closer, its form began to change. It flowed and shifted, adopting aspects of the deer's appearance while maintaining its otherworldly characteristics. For a moment, there were two deer in the chamber. One real, one an impossible reflection from a reality where deer were predators instead of prey. The false deer opened its mouth, revealing rows of crystalline teeth that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. When it bit down on the real deer's neck, the animal didn't just die, it was consumed across every reality where it had ever existed. Sweet Jesus, I breathed. The consumption process transfers the victim's entire quantum signature to the entity, Hartwell explained with clinical detachment. Not just their death in this reality, but their potential deaths across all possible timelines. It's the most complete form of predation imaginable. The remaining animals were consumed in similar fashion, each death more horrific than the last. The black bear put up the most resistance, but even its strength was meaningless against predators that could attack it across multiple dimensions simultaneously. When the feeding was complete, the entities began to fade back into their interdimensional spaces, but before they disappeared entirely, one of them, the largest, most complex of the group, turned toward our observation window. For a moment that lasted an eternity, I made eye contact with something that existed beyond the boundaries of sanity. Its gaze was ancient, intelligent, and filled with a hunger that extended far beyond mere physical sustenance. In that moment, I understood with crystal clarity that these entities weren't just interdimensional predators. They were scouts. Advance agents for something much larger, much more terrible, that was slowly finding its way into our reality. The observation window began to develop hairline fractures where the entity's gaze had focused. Cross immediately hit an emergency alarm, and blast shields slammed down over all viewing portals. "What the hell just happened?" I demanded. "Direct consciousness contact," Hartwell replied, her face pale. "The entities are becoming more aware of us as observers. That's never happened before." Chapter 4. The Breach Protocol. The incident with the observation window triggered what the facility called a Level 3 breach protocol. All personnel were confined to their quarters, while a specialized team conducted what Cross euphemistically termed dimensional stability assessments. I spent 3 days locked in a small room deep within the facility, with nothing but government-issued reading materials, and the growing certainty that I had made a terrible mistake in accepting this assignment. On the 4th day, Morrison visited my quarters. He looked older than when I'd first met him, as if the stress of recent events had aged him years in a matter of days. "Dr. Vasquez, we need to talk. The entities have been exhibiting unprecedented behavior since your observation session," he began. "They're spending more time in our dimensional space, testing the boundaries of their containment system. More concerning, they've begun attempting direct communication." "Communication with whom?" "With you, specifically." Morrison slid a manila folder across the small table between us. Inside were photographs taken by the facility's dimensional monitoring equipment, images that showed the containment chamber during non-feeding periods. In every photograph, the entities had arranged themselves in patterns that, when viewed from the observation deck, spelled out letters. My name. Over and over again in configurations that shouldn't have been possible for creatures that existed partially outside our reality. "They want to communicate with me. Why?" "We believe your consciousness made a deeper connection with them than anyone else who's worked at this facility. Your theoretical work on dimensional membrane permeability may have given you an intuitive understanding of their nature that they recognize. There's something else, Dr. Vasquez, something we haven't told you about the true purpose of Project Threshold. Morrison's expression became grave, the kind of seriousness that precedes revelations that shatter worldviews. These entities aren't prisoners here, they're partners. The truth, when it came, was worse than anything I could have imagined. Project Threshold wasn't a containment operation, it was a collaboration. For 47 years, our government had been working with the interdimensional entities, trading regular feeding for what Morrison called dimensional intelligence. Intelligence about what? About threats from other realities. These entities exist across multiple dimensional planes simultaneously. They can see things coming that we can't. Invasions, catastrophes, extinctions from realities where humanity made different choices. The entities had been feeding information to human governments for decades, helping us avoid conflicts and disasters by showing us glimpses of timelines where those catastrophes had occurred. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the Chernobyl disaster, the 2008 financial collapse, all events that had been mitigated or prevented entirely based on warnings from our interdimensional partners. The price for this information has been regular feeding and, more recently, human volunteers for what we call the Consciousness Bridge program. Human volunteers for what? Morrison's expression became impossibly grim. Selected individuals who allow the entities to experience human consciousness directly. The volunteers enter a controlled dimensional interface state, and the entities temporarily merge with their cognitive processes. What happens to the volunteers? Most of them survive the process. They return with extraordinary insights into the nature of reality, enhanced cognitive abilities, and an intuitive understanding of dimensional physics that advances our research by decades. And the ones who don't survive, they become something else, something that exists between human and entity consciousness. We call them bridges, beings that can communicate with the entities in ways we never imagined possible. You're telling me you've been feeding human beings to these things? Not feeding, Dr. Vasquez. Facilitating controlled consciousness merger for the advancement of human knowledge and survival. The euphemisms couldn't hide the reality of what Morrison was describing. For nearly half a century, our government had been systematically sacrificing people to interdimensional predators in exchange for information about potential futures. Cross entered the room accompanied by two people I hadn't seen before, a woman in military fatigues and a man in a black suit who radiated the kind of authority that comes from making decisions other people die for. Dr. Vasquez, the man in the suit said, "I'm Deputy Director Garrett from the Department of Extra-Normal Research. We have a proposition for you. The entities have specifically requested you as their next Consciousness Bridge volunteer. This is unprecedented. They've never requested a specific individual before. We believe your theoretical work on dimensional physics has made you uniquely qualified to survive the bridge process. And if I refuse..." Garrett's smile was cold and professional. "Dr. Vasquez, you've been exposed to classified information that would cause mass panic if it became public. You've seen technology and entities that officially don't exist. You have two choices: participate in the bridge program and advance human understanding of dimensional physics, or be permanently assigned to this facility for the remainder of your natural life. The bridge process will take place tomorrow at 1400 hours. I suggest you use the remaining time to prepare yourself mentally for what will be the most significant experience in human scientific history." I sat alone in that small room, staring at consent forms that essentially signed away my humanity in the name of scientific advancement. But as I read through the technical specifications of the Consciousness Bridge protocol, I began to understand something that the project administrators had missed: The entities weren't looking for volunteers to merge with. They were looking for a way to escape their dimensional containment, and I was going to be their ticket out. Chapter 5. The Bridge. The Consciousness Bridge Laboratory was located in the deepest level of Station Threshold, in a chamber that had been specially designed to exist in controlled dimensional flux. The walls were lined with monitoring equipment that tracked everything from brain activity to quantum field fluctuations. Dr. Amanda Sterling, the facility's chief neurologist, oversaw the preparation process. She was a precise woman who spoke about consciousness merger with the same clinical detachment most doctors reserved for routine surgery. The process involves temporary dissolution of your dimensional boundaries, she explained, as technicians attached monitoring equipment to my head and chest. The entities will be able to access your consciousness directly, experiencing human thought patterns while you gain access to their interdimensional perceptions. Previous subjects have described the experience as transformative. You'll perceive reality as it truly exists, not just our limited three-dimensional slice, but the full spectrum of dimensional space where these entities naturally exist. I was strapped to a chair that looked like a cross between medical equipment and medieval restraint device, with cables and sensors connected to every part of my body. Around me, dozens of monitors displayed my vital signs, brain activity, and measurements I couldn't begin to interpret. Dr. Vasquez, Morrison's voice came through the speakers. The entities are in position. Are you ready to begin the bridge protocol? Through the reinforced viewing window, I could see into the main containment chamber. The entities were arranged in a perfect circle, their forms more solid and defined than I'd ever seen them. They seemed to be focusing their attention on the bridge laboratory, and I could feel the weight of their alien intelligence pressing against the boundaries of my consciousness. Initialize dimensional barrier reduction, Sterling announced. The first sensation was disorientation, a feeling like falling sideways through space that didn't exist. The laboratory around me began to blur and shift, walls becoming translucent as the barriers between dimensions weakened. Then came the contact. The entity consciousness touched mine with infinite gentleness, and suddenly I wasn't alone in my own head. I could feel its thoughts overlaying mine, ancient, vast, and utterly alien. But beneath the strangeness, I sensed something unexpected, curiosity, and something that might have been loneliness. You are different from the others, came a voice that wasn't quite a voice, speaking words that weren't quite words. You understand the spaces between spaces. Through the entity's perceptions, I saw the laboratory as it truly existed, not just as a three-dimensional space, but as a complex intersection of multiple realities. I could see the past and future of the room simultaneously, its construction, its eventual destruction, and dozens of alternate versions where it had never been built at all. But more terrifying, I could see the truth about Project Threshold. The feeding program wasn't just about sustaining the entities. Every animal they consumed, every human consciousness they bridged with, was being used to map the dimensional barriers between realities. They were learning the structure of our universe's defenses, finding weak points where their home dimension could breach into ours. We are not the invasion, the entity's thoughts whispered through my mind. We are the scouts, and the mapping is almost complete. Through the entity's senses, I perceived something that the facility's instruments couldn't detect. A massive presence in the space between dimensions, something so vast that the entities at Station Threshold were like individual cells in its cosmic body. The true intelligence behind the interdimensional incursions wasn't the entities we'd been studying. They were just fingers of something incomprehensibly large that existed across all realities simultaneously, reaching through dimensional barriers to test the structural integrity of our universe. Your species calls it many names, the entity explained. Destroyer of worlds, the hunger between stars. In your ancient texts, it was called the Devourer of Light. Dr. Vasquez, Sterling's voice seemed to come from very far away. Your neural activity is off the charts. We need to terminate the bridge protocol. But it was too late. The consciousness merger had revealed information that the project administrators had never intended me to access. Through the entity's perceptions, I could see the complete timeline of Project Threshold and its true purpose. The government hadn't discovered the entities by accident. The entities had allowed themselves to be found, guiding human researchers to establish contact. Every step of the project had been orchestrated by intelligences that existed beyond human comprehension, manipulating us into building the perfect dimensional gateway for their master to enter our reality. The Consciousness Bridge program wasn't about advancing human knowledge. It was about creating human-entity hybrid beings that could serve as anchors for a full-scale dimensional invasion. "System overload!" a technician shouted. "The dimensional barriers are collapsing!" Through my enhanced perceptions, I could see cracks forming in the fabric of reality itself. The bridge process had weakened the dimensional boundaries around Station Threshold, and something vast and hungry was beginning to push through from the other side. "It comes," the entity whispered in my mind. "The ancient hunger awakens, and your reality will feed it well." But in that moment of cosmic horror, I realized something the entities hadn't expected. My consciousness wasn't just bridging with theirs. I was learning to navigate dimensional space independently, and that meant I might be able to do something they couldn't anticipate. I might be able to fight back. Using abilities I didn't know I possessed, I reached out through dimensional space and began to reinforce the barriers the entities had been weakening. It was like trying to hold back the ocean with my bare hands, but for a moment, just a moment, I felt the invasion pause. "Impossible," the entity hissed. "No human consciousness can manipulate dimensional structure." "Watch me," I whispered, and pushed back with everything I had. Chapter 6. The Escape. The Consciousness Bridge Laboratory erupted in sparks and smoke as my dimensional manipulation overloaded every system in the facility. The sudden reinforcement of reality's barriers sent a feedback pulse through the entity network that left them temporarily stunned and disoriented. In that brief window of opportunity, I tore free from the restraints and monitoring equipment, my consciousness still partially merged with interdimensional space. I could perceive the facility's layout from multiple angles simultaneously, seeing not just the physical structure, but the dimensional weak points the entities had been exploiting. "Dr. Vasquez," Sterling called out as I burst through the laboratory door. "The entity containment system is failing. You need to get to the emergency evacuation point." But I wasn't interested in evacuation. My enhanced perceptions had revealed the location of the facility's dimensional anchor array, the system that kept Station Threshold stable in our reality. If I could overload it, I might be able to seal the dimensional breaches permanently. The corridors of Station Threshold had become a nightmare landscape as the dimensional barriers continued to fluctuate. Walls phased in and out of existence, revealing glimpses of the facility as it existed in alternate realities. In some, it was a smoking ruin. In others, it had never been built. And in one terrifying glimpse, I saw it overrun with creatures that made the entities look benign by comparison. Cross found me in the main corridor, his face streaked with blood from flying debris. "Dr. Vasquez, what did you do in there? The entities have gone completely berserk." Through the reinforced windows that looked into the main containment chamber, we could see the entities in various states of dimensional flux. Some appeared to be dissolving into their component geometries, while others were taking on increasingly solid and threatening forms. "They're losing cohesion," I explained, my voice strange to my own ears as it carried harmonics from interdimensional space. "The master intelligence they serve is trying to maintain control across multiple realities simultaneously. My interference disrupted their network." But even as we spoke, I could sense the vast intelligence behind the entities, adapting to my intervention. It was learning to compensate for human consciousness that could manipulate dimensional space, adjusting its approach to account for this unexpected variable. "We need to get to the dimensional anchor array," I told Cross. "It's the only way to seal the breaches permanently." We turned to see Morrison approaching with a team of armed security personnel. His expression was grim, and the weapon in his hand was pointed directly at me. "I'm sorry, Dr. Vasquez, but I can't let you do that. Project Threshold represents 47 years of careful cooperation with beings that can help humanity survive what's coming. I won't let you destroy that relationship." "Morrison, you don't understand. They're not trying to help us. They're mapping our defenses for something that wants to devour our entire reality. The entities have never lied to us. They've provided accurate intelligence that has saved millions of lives. Your consciousness bridge revealed classified information, but your interpretation of that information may be flawed. Through my enhanced perceptions, I could see Morrison's dimensional signature and the subtle alterations that indicated previous exposure to entity consciousness. He wasn't just a project administrator. He was a bridge himself, one whose consciousness had been so thoroughly merged with entity intelligence that he could no longer distinguish between human and alien motivations. I moved faster than should have been possible, my partially interdimensional consciousness allowing me to perceive and react to events across multiple timeline probabilities simultaneously. The weapon discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as I disarmed Morrison and continued toward the anchor array control room. The dimensional anchor array was housed in a chamber that hurt to look at directly. Massive crystalline structures arranged in geometric patterns that folded through space in ways that violated every law of physics I'd studied. These anchors were what kept the facility stable in our reality, while allowing controlled dimensional access for the entities. The control console was a nightmare of interfaces designed for human operation of technology that existed partially outside our dimensional space. But my consciousness bridge experience had given me an intuitive understanding of how the systems functioned. As I began inputting the overload sequence, I could feel the attention of the vast intelligence behind the entities focusing on the facility. It knew what I was trying to do, and it was mobilizing every resource at its disposal to stop me. The entities began manifesting throughout the facility in increasingly solid forms, no longer content to remain in their containment chamber. I could hear screams from personnel in other sections of the complex as the interdimensional predators began hunting humans directly. "Dimensional anchor overload initiated," the computer announced in a calm voice that contrasted horribly with the chaos erupting around me. "Cascade failure in 60 seconds. Through the facility's internal monitoring system, I watched the entity's desperate attempts to maintain their dimensional bridgehead. They were pouring more and more of their essence into our reality, becoming increasingly vulnerable to the anchor system overload. The door to the control room began to buckle as something massive struck it from the outside. Through my dimensional perceptions, I could see one of the entities in its most solid form yet, a creature that combined aspects of every animal it had ever consumed, arranged in a configuration that existed in too many dimensions simultaneously. 30 seconds to cascade failure. The entity that entered the control room was beyond description. It was every predator that had ever lived, every nightmare that had ever haunted human dreams, every fear that lurked in the spaces between sleeping and waking, and it was hungry. You cannot stop what has already begun. Its voice filled my mind like poison. The mapping is complete. The barriers are known. The devourer comes regardless of your small defiance. 10 seconds to cascade failure. The entity moved toward me with fluid grace, its form shifting and adapting as it prepared to consume not just my life but my existence across all possible realities. But in those final moments, I made a choice that the vast intelligence behind the invasion had never anticipated. Instead of trying to escape or fight the entity directly, I opened my consciousness completely to the dimensional space around us and became a willing conduit for the anchor system overload. Cascade failure initiated. Chapter 7. The Aftermath. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed in Seattle with no memory of how I'd gotten there. The official story was that I'd been found unconscious near a hiking trail in Olympic National Forest, apparently the victim of a bear attack that had left me with minor injuries and temporary amnesia. There was no record of Station Threshold, no evidence that Project Threshold had ever existed. The interdimensional entities, the Consciousness Bridge program, the 47 years of government cooperation with beings from other realities, all of it had been erased from official records with the thoroughness that only comes from decades of practice. But I remember everything. The dimensional anchor overload had worked, but not in the way I'd intended. Instead of sealing the interdimensional breaches permanently, it had shifted them, scattered them across thousands of locations throughout the Pacific Northwest. The entity's carefully planned invasion point had been shattered into fragments too small and unstable for their master intelligence to exploit. But the victory came at a cost. The scattered dimensional fragments had created hundreds of small breaches throughout America's forests, weak points where the entities could still slip through in limited numbers. They could no longer mount a coordinated invasion, but they were still out there, still hunting. The news reports started appearing within weeks of my awakening. Hikers disappearing in national forests across the Pacific Northwest. Search and rescue teams finding campsites where all the gear remained intact, but the people had simply vanished. Wildlife behaving strangely, fleeing certain areas of forest as if driven by primal terror. Dr. Vasquez. The voice on the phone was unfamiliar, but carried the weight of authority I'd learned to recognize. This is Agent Patricia Rouse, Department of Interior. We need to discuss your recent experience. The meeting took place in a nondescript office building in downtown Seattle. Agent Rouse was a sharp-featured woman who spoke with the precision of someone accustomed to dealing with information that could destabilize governments. What you did at the facility has created a new problem, she explained, sliding a thick folder across the desk. The entity manifestations are no longer contained to a single location. We're tracking dimensional instabilities across 17 states, with confirmed entity sightings in over 40 locations. The photographs in the folder showed familiar horrors, creatures that existed between dimensions, predators that could mimic any living thing they'd consumed. But these weren't the controlled, well-fed entities of Station Threshold. These were desperate, hungry, and increasingly aggressive. The scattered breaches are too small and unstable for large-scale manifestations, but they're perfect for individual entity incursions. We're looking at a situation where these creatures are dispersed throughout America's wilderness areas, hunting in small groups or as individuals. How many people have disappeared? Confirmed missing, 137. Presumed entity encounters, 43. Survivors, 6. Agent Rouse leaned forward, her expression grave. Dr. Vasquez, your consciousness still carries traces of the dimensional bridge experience. You can perceive these entities in ways our equipment can't. We need your help to track them down and seal the remaining breaches. And if I refuse? then we're looking at an indefinite escalation of disappearances across America's national forests. These entities are learning, adapting, becoming more effective predators. Eventually, they'll figure out how to expand the breaches and coordinate their activities. For the past 3 months, I've been leading what the government calls Cleanup Protocol 7, a classified operation to locate and contain the scattered entity manifestations throughout America's wilderness areas. It's dangerous work that requires a team of specialists who've been exposed to dimensional physics and survived. Each mission takes us deeper into forests where reality becomes unstable, where predators from other dimensions hunt using abilities that shouldn't exist. We've learned to recognize the signs, areas where compasses spin wildly, where digital cameras malfunction, where the local wildlife has fled entirely. The entities have adapted to their dispersed existence. Without the controlled feeding program of Station Threshold, they've become scavengers, opportunistic predators that strike at isolated hikers and campers. But they're also learning about human behavior, studying our patterns and weaknesses. "Dr. Vasquez," came the voice of Lieutenant Kane, our military liaison, through the radio. "We've got multiple dimensional readings converging on your position. Whatever's out there, it's big." Through my enhanced perceptions, I could sense the entity before we saw it. A presence that existed in multiple realities simultaneously, pressing against the boundaries of our dimensional space, like a tumor trying to break through healthy tissue. It emerged from behind a cluster of ancient Douglas firs, its form shifting between the appearance of a massive grizzly bear and something that had no name in any human language. Its eyes reflected not just light, but glimpses of the realities where it naturally existed, dimensions where humans were prey and predators hunted across the boundaries of space and time. "Remember the protocol," I whispered into my radio. "Don't look directly at it. Use the dimensional scramblers to destabilize its manifestation field. And whatever you do, don't let it make direct eye contact." The dimensional scramblers were technology reverse-engineered from the Station Threshold equipment, devices that could disrupt the reality manipulation abilities that allowed the entities to maintain coherent forms in our dimensional space. The creature's form began to destabilize as the scramblers took effect, its shape flickering between dimensions as it lost its grip on our reality. But in its desperation, it did something I'd never seen before. It began to partially merge with the surrounding forest. Trees began to move with predatory intelligence, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. The forest floor itself became treacherous as roots and undergrowth responded to the entity's will. We weren't just fighting an interdimensional predator, we were fighting the entire ecosystem it had infected. "Initiating dimensional anchor deployment," Kane called out as his team set up portable versions of the technology that had sealed Station Threshold. "All personnel maintain safe distance." The portable anchors created a field of dimensional stability that forced the entity back into its natural interdimensional state. But as it began to fade from our reality, it turned its attention directly to me. "The mapping continues," its voice filled my mind. "Each breach teaches us more about your reality's structure. Each hunt reveals new weaknesses. The devourer is patient and hunger is eternal." As the entity disappeared back into interdimensional space, I realized the true scope of what we were facing. Each scattered breach wasn't just a problem to be contained, it was a learning opportunity for the vast intelligence behind the invasions. Every encounter was teaching them more about how to exploit our reality's defenses. We've sealed 43 breaches in the past 3 months, but I know there are hundreds more scattered throughout America's forests, and with each one we close, the entities become more clever, more adaptable, more dangerous. Chapter 8. The Truth About the Forests. Tonight, as I compile my final report for the Department of Interior, I'm forced to confront a truth that will terrify anyone who enjoys America's wilderness areas. The entities aren't just hiding in our forests, they're transforming them. The dimensional breach locations follow a pattern that took months to recognize. They're not randomly distributed throughout the wilderness. They're strategically placed at points where the barriers between realities are naturally thin. Ancient places where Native American tribes reported encounters with spirits that walked between worlds. Locations where early settlers documented disappearances and strange phenomena that were dismissed as frontier superstition. The entities have been using these natural weak points in reality's fabric to establish permanent footholds in our dimension. But more terrifying, they're expanding these footholds by fundamentally altering the local ecosystem. During our containment missions, we've documented changes in plant and animal behavior that suggest the entities are somehow infecting the forest themselves with interdimensional properties. Trees that exist partially in multiple realities, wildlife that displays predatory behaviors impossible for their species, areas where time flows at different rates depending on your position within the forest. Dr. Vasquez, came the recorded voice of Dr. Sarah Kim, our team's botanist. The plant samples from the Cascade Breach site are exhibiting cellular structures that shouldn't be possible. They're metabolizing energy from sources that don't exist in our dimensional space. The infected forests are becoming hybridized ecosystems, part terrestrial wilderness, part interdimensional hunting ground. The entities are creating environments where they can exist more easily in our reality, while remaining difficult for humans to detect or track. Base, this is Alpha Team. We've got a situation at the Olympic Peninsula site. The breach we sealed last month is showing signs of regeneration, and the local wildlife, Jesus, you need to see this. The emergency response to the Olympic Peninsula took us to a section of forest we thought was completely cleared of entity presence. What we found there changed our understanding of how the dimensional infection spread. The trees in the affected area were growing in impossible configurations, trunks that curved through space in ways that violated physics, canopies that seemed to exist at multiple heights simultaneously. But more disturbing were the animals. A family of deer approached our team without fear, their movements fluid and predatory. When they opened their mouths, we saw rows of carnivorous teeth arranged in patterns that belonged in nightmare dimensions. They'd been transformed by prolonged exposure to interdimensional energy, becoming predators that retained their innocent appearance while developing hunting instincts from realities where herbivores never existed. These aren't infected animals, I realized with growing horror. They're entity-animal hybrids. The dimensional energy is rewriting their genetic structure at the quantum level. The implications were staggering. If the entities could transform local wildlife into hybrid predators, they were essentially creating an army of creatures that could hunt humans while appearing completely innocent. Imagine encountering what looks like a family of rabbits on a hiking trail, only to discover they've developed the hunting instincts of interdimensional apex predators. Command, this is Dr. Vasquez. We need to implement a complete wilderness quarantine protocol for all affected areas. The entity contamination is spreading through the local ecosystem in ways we never anticipated. But the response from headquarters was troubling. Negative, Dr. Vasquez. Political considerations prevent large-scale park closures, contain the immediate threats, and maintain operational secrecy. The government's refusal to acknowledge the scope of the problem means that millions of Americans continue to visit wilderness areas that have been fundamentally altered by interdimensional contamination. Every hiking trail, every camping trip, every family vacation to national parks carries the risk of encountering predators that exist beyond the boundaries of natural law. The disappearance statistics tell the real story. Missing hikers and campers have increased by 340% in areas where we've documented dimensional breaches. Search and rescue operations find abandoned campsites where all equipment remains intact, but the people have simply vanished, leaving behind only traces of interdimensional energy that our instruments can barely detect. During our most recent mission to the Cascade Range, we discovered something that confirmed my worst fears about the long-term implications of the entity presence. We found a breach that had been active for over 6 months, long enough for the local dimensional contamination to reach what our instruments measured as critical saturation levels. The forest around the breach had become something that couldn't exist in our reality under normal circumstances. Trees that grew downward into the sky, streams that flowed uphill toward sources that existed in adjacent dimensions, wildlife that flickered in and out of visibility as they moved between realities. And in the center of this impossible wilderness, we found evidence of something that made my blood freeze. Human survivors who had been living in the contaminated zone for months, gradually adapting to the interdimensional environment. They called themselves the Bridged, people who had survived entity encounters by allowing partial consciousness merger, becoming human-entity hybrids capable of existing in the contaminated forests. They retained human intelligence, but had developed predatory instincts and the ability to perceive multiple dimensions simultaneously. "The forests are changing," one of them explained, her voice carrying harmonics from interdimensional space. "They're becoming gateways, places where the boundaries between worlds grow thin enough for larger entities to cross over." Larger entities. The ones we encountered at Station Threshold were scouts, advance agents. The real invasion force exists in dimensions where entire planets serve as hunting grounds for predators the size of solar systems. The Bridged had learned to survive in the contaminated forests by accepting transformation, becoming something between human and entity. But their survival came at the cost of their humanity, and they served as living warnings of what awaited anyone who spent too long in areas where dimensional barriers had been compromised. We extracted what data we could from the site and implemented emergency containment protocols, but I knew it was too little, too late. The contamination was spreading faster than we could contain it, and the government's insistence on maintaining secrecy prevented the kind of large-scale response the situation demanded. As we lifted off from the contaminated zone, I took one last look at the forest below. In the failing daylight, I could see patches of wilderness that flickered between realities, areas where trees and wildlife existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. America's forests were becoming something else, hunting grounds for predators from dimensions where humanity had never evolved, where the very concept of mercy or restraint was alien and incomprehensible. Final warning. As I finish this account, 3 months have passed since the Station Threshold incident. The official records will never reflect what really happened there, and the scattered dimensional breaches throughout America's wilderness continue to spread their contamination unchecked. The missing person statistics from national parks and forests have reached levels that can no longer be explained by natural causes, but the media continues to attribute the disappearances to bear attacks, getting lost, or simple accidents. The truth is too terrible for public consumption and too dangerous for government acknowledgement. Dr. Vasquez, this is Agent Rouse. We've lost contact with 2 more containment teams in the past week. The entities are becoming more organized, more aggressive. We need you back in the field immediately. Every day brings new reports of dimensional instabilities, of wildlife behaving in ways that violate natural law, of forests where reality itself has become unreliable. The entities are learning, adapting, preparing for something that will make the original invasion attempt look like a minor incursion. The pattern is becoming clear to those of us who know what to look for. The scattered breaches are converging, creating networks of dimensional instability that span entire mountain ranges. What began as isolated contamination sites are becoming interconnected gateways for entities that exist beyond the boundaries of human comprehension. I'm heading back into the field tonight, to a site in the North Cascades, where our instruments have detected dimensional readings unlike anything we've encountered before. The breach there isn't just allowing individual entities to cross over, it's creating a stable portal for something much larger. All units, this is Dr. Vasquez, approaching the target site now. Dimensional readings are off the charts. Whatever's coming through this breach, it's bigger than anything we've dealt with before. The forest around the new breach was completely silent. No bird calls, no insect sounds, no wind through the trees. It was the silence of an ecosystem that had fled or been consumed, leaving behind only the presence of something that shouldn't exist in our reality. Through my enhanced perceptions, I could sense the entity before we saw it. This wasn't one of the scout forms we'd been dealing with. This was something from the invasion force the Bridged had warned us about. A predator designed for conquest rather than reconnaissance. It emerged from the breach like a living mountain, its form so vast and complex that my consciousness could only process fragments of its true appearance. It was every apex predator that had ever existed across all realities, combined into a single entity that existed to hunt and consume on a planetary scale. "Fall back," I shouted into my radio. "This is beyond our containment capabilities. We need immediate nuclear sterilization of this entire area." But even as I called for evacuation, I knew it was too late. The entity had fully manifested in our reality, and it was already beginning to spread its influence across the surrounding wilderness. Through the entity's presence, I sensed the arrival of others. The breach had become stable enough to allow multiple invasion-class entities to cross over simultaneously. What we were witnessing wasn't just another containment situation. It was the beginning of the full-scale dimensional invasion that Station Threshold had been designed to facilitate. As our extraction helicopter lifted us away from the breach site, I took one final look at the forest below. The trees were already beginning to change, their forms shifting to accommodate predators that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The invasion had begun, and America's forests would be ground zero for a conflict between realities that humanity was woefully unprepared to fight. This is my final transmission as part of Cleanup Protocol 7. By the time anyone reads this account, the dimensional contamination will have spread beyond any hope of containment. The entities that our government thought they could control and study have proven to be advanced scouts for something infinitely more dangerous. To anyone who ventures into America's wilderness areas, understand this. The forests are no longer safe. They have become hunting grounds for predators from realities where humans are nothing more than another species to be consumed and forgotten. The government knows what lives in America's forests now, and it shouldn't exist, but it does, and it's hungry. The next time you plan a camping trip, a hiking adventure, or a peaceful retreat into America's wilderness, remember Dr. Elena Vasquez's warning. The shadows between the trees may hide more than you ever imagined, and some secrets are too dangerous to remain buried. If you found this account as terrifying as I hope you did, don't forget to subscribe to the Obscura Law Vault for more investigations into the truths they never wanted you to know. Hit that like button if this story left you questioning your next outdoor adventure, and share it with anyone brave enough to handle the truth about what really lurks in America's forests. Sweet dreams, and stay out of the woods.